City of London, home to some of history's most iconic places and buildings. Buildings that are so steeped in history that they attract literally thousands of visitors each day from all parts of the world. But today, I'm here at probably one of the most famous buildings of them all, Westminster Abbey. This building has seen the crowning of many a monarch and of course is also the final resting place for many of England's famous people. People who have emanated through time, often changing the course of history. However, I'm here to show you the final resting place of a former King of England, one that presided over a 22-year reign that was not only authoritarian in its nature, but absolute. His reign was epitomised by a period renowned for its brutality, treachery and death. A time we now refer to as the Tyranny. And the name of this king? Well, Richard II, King of England. Edward III's heir to the throne was his son Edward, the Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince. Now, the Black Prince died unexpectedly in 1376. This then meant that his son Richard, Edward III's grandson, was now the heir apparent. At this time though, the English Commons had real concerns that John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle, could seize the throne for himself. Now, as a result of these concerns, Richard received his father's titles, including the Princedom of Wales, soon after becoming heir. Then, after a 50-year reign, King Edward III, Richard's grandfather, passed away 1 year after Richard became heir. His health had been deteriorating for some time. As a result of this, Richard, who was then only 10 years old, became king. On July the 16th, 1377, in Westminster Abbey, he was duly crowned. Now, just because Richard had become king, his position was still thought by many nobles to be precarious, and they harboured suspicions that John of Gaunt continued to possess his own ambitions for the throne. Therefore, it was decided that England would not be ruled by a regency of Richard's uncles, which would normally have been the case, but instead to use a system by which a number of continual councils would be used to assist the king to formally execute his rule. John of Gaunt, of course, was excluded from all this. Gaunt and his young brother Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, continued to have a significant informal influence over governmental affairs, but the king's advisors and friends, particularly Robert de Vere and Simon de Burgh, began to exert their influence over royal matters. This, of course, was not sustainable, and a clash between the two factions was eventually inevitable. The first crisis in Richard's short reign was fast approaching. 3 poll taxes had been imposed between 1377 and 1381, which were used to fund unsuccessful military operations, mainly against France. These added to the dark mood by placing an ever heavier burden on taxpayers. These ever increasing taxes were used to pay for, well, what amounted to military failure. The people's financial burdens led to a growing source of unhappiness and general frustration. Because of this, by the year 1381, the poorer strata of English society had developed a deep-seated animosity towards the ruling elites. This festering resentment was mostly directed towards the king's advisors and upper echelons of society, rather than towards the young king himself. Now, not only were the masses Incensed with the authorities' tax collecting schemes, there was also widespread consternation of what they saw as increasing government corruption and poor administration. This final straw came when the poll tax was increased to a standard contribution of 1 shilling per head in November 1380, which was 3 times the poll tax from 1377. To make matters worse, it was no longer graded according to status, as it was previously. The masses had had enough. This historically high rate of tax led to huge rates of evasion. This, of course, in turn, led the government to deploy increasingly harsher and more draconian methods to collect it. One chronicler claims the collectors extracted the money inhumanely, resulting in numerous injuries amid much intimidation. This soon inspired the rural population to rise up in rebellion. As a result, a battleground was created across southern England and London in particular. This rebellion in 1381 was later to be known as the Great Revolt or Peasants Revolt. Now, in some ways, the common term Peasants Revolt is quite insulting to those who took part in it, as well as being more than a little misleading. The movement was actually led by ambitious and well-educated individuals, people with some level of wealth, power and influence in their local communities. It spread from region to region through both the means of writing and preaching. One of the most interesting facts to come out of the revolt is that it was possibly England's first real example of the strengths and hazards of widespread literacy. To have a literate community, all a village needed was to have just one person who could read. The revolt started at the end of May 1381 when a group of villagers in Brentwood, Essex, attacked one of the tax collectors, declaring that they would not pay another penny of the dreaded poll tax. Bizarrely, many people who were being forced to pay the tax had in fact already paid and had the receipts from the tax collector to prove it. To their consternation, this made little difference as they were still being pestered and pressured into paying again. Essex and Kent saw several uprisings, and then in early June, rebels poured into the city of London in their thousands. By this time, the king had little option but to seek refuge in the Tower of London. Whilst on the march, the mob burned manor houses and seized men they believed to be representatives of lordly oppression and publicly beheaded them. The rebels made a vow on June the 2nd in Essex to destroy various lieges of the king and to have no law in England except only those which they themselves moved to be ordained. Worryingly for the king and his administration though, the rebellion had begun to take on the look and feel of a full-blown revolution. Now for Richard and his advisors, something had to be done. But what? One thing to remember in all this, the 14-year-old king was not the rebels' target because they saw him as a natural ally of the common people. This of course proved to be a major miscalculation in the long run. They just had no idea who they were dealing with. When the mob finally reached London Bridge, the mayor quickly closed the drawbridge to block them from entering. But due to confusion and with rebel supporters on both sides of the river, it was swiftly lifted and they then poured into the city en masse. Small amounts of damage were first caused. The rebels had specific targets. They wanted to destroy legal documents, as these they saw as tools of corruption and oppression. The property of those who they considered to be leaders of the oppression were also deemed fair game. Along the Strand they destroyed John of Gaunt's manor house by burning it to the ground. Other residences of the establishment were destroyed. The rebels themselves executed a man who was caught looting. According to one chronicler, they claimed that they were zealots for truth and justice, not thieves or robbers. Ensconced in the tower, King Richard was seen through the smoke, watching the chaos evolve all around him from high up on one of the building's turrets. Now was the time he and his advisors had to make a decision, and make it fast. The king had the option of sending in hundreds of men-at-arms and knights who were based just outside the city with the purpose of confronting the rebels. But did he have enough men? Also at this point in time, it just wasn't clear who London's general population would side with. Not only would a confrontation be extremely bloody, the outcome would be far from certain. A mob on foot can move very quickly in a city. Knights on horseback would find battle in close quarters extremely difficult in the maze of the city's narrow streets and alleyways. It soon became obvious to the king that negotiation would be the least riskier option to navigate a way out of the crisis. On June the 15th, Richard organised a meeting with the rebel leaders. The building in front of us is London's famous Smithfield Meat Market, but back then it was open ground, outside the city walls and the site where the famous meeting between Richard and the rebels took place. The king was confronted at Smithfield by a sizable group of rebels, including their leader, Wat Tyler, who had come forward to meet him. At the meeting, Wat Tyler's manner immediately rang alarm bells for Richard's guard. He openly carried a dagger, demanded and drank a cup of ale, and allegedly tried to instigate a fight with one of the king's men, all of which the chroniclers describe with disgust due to Tyler's arrogant disregard for the status of the monarch. This was a pretext to demand his arrest, and in the altercation that followed, Tyler was hit across the head by a sword carried by one of Richard's men. He slumped from his horse and to the ground dead. Now came King Richard's big moment, his one truly heroic action that prevented calamity on what was now effectively fast becoming a battlefield. As soon as the rebels realised their commander was dead, they raised their bows and staves and prepared for battle. At this point, Richard rode out to them and into the crowd and shouted that he was their king and they could not wish to hurt him. Richard was, whether he knew it or not, in mortal danger, but the king's actions had placated the mob. The king's goal now, of course, was to encourage the rebels to disperse and leave the city, and in this he was successful. The rebels, now effectively leaderless, were consoled by Richard's repeated kind words and assurances that he understood their grievances, would do something about them, and ensure an amnesty and justice for all. Up to now, this was Richard's greatest moment. Richard's success at Smithfield was unquestionably a huge victory for the 14-year-old king. He showed tremendous courage. He could have used this as a springboard so as to put a positive stamp onto the start of a long and successful reign, one where he could have been loved and respected by his people. But it was not to be. He couldn't learn the crucial lesson that no king should have to seek a victory over his very own people, or have brought about circumstances where one was necessary. Richard's idea of the subsequent peace was absolute submission to his will and to the majesty of kingship. If the rebels thought they were dealing with a just king who was sympathetic to their situation and would fight for their interests, then they very quickly learnt otherwise. Richard was a very different king. The rebel ringleaders were swiftly apprehended and put to death, and all concessions Richard made to the Commons were later revoked by Parliament the following month. This was when Richard's tyrannous side first showed its ugly face. All in all, more than 1,500 rebels from the length and breadth of the country were swiftly executed. Richard showed the nation that his rule would be very different from those that had preceded him. His reign would be based on fear. The government was then quick to reassert its total control of the nation, emphasising the social hierarchy that firmly cemented the king at the top. The king's position firmly depended on the stability of that structure, but subsequent events would prove that Richard had no understanding of this dependency. After Richard put down the Peasants Revolt, the king married Anne of Bohemia, the daughter of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, on January the 20th, 1382. This was one of Richard's first notable acts after the uprising. It had various diplomatic implications. Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire were seen to be prospective partners in the ongoing 100 Years' War against France. It was in 1383 that Richard first provoked the establishment and the commons by showing favouritism to his friends. Michael de la Pole was elevated to Chancellor, and 2 years later he elevated him to the rank of Earl of Suffolk. Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, who at this time came to be another of the king's close friends. The political establishment objected to Richard and de Vere's tight bond. The Earl's promotion to the new rank of Duke of Ireland only served to infuriate the old guard of the establishment. When Richard was 18 years old, he embarked on the military expedition that was supposed to mark his coming of age in 1385. A small force of French men-at-arms had joined the Scots in launching incursions into northern England at the end of July. The French did this so as to divert English attention from French preparations for a full-scale invasion of the south coast. Richard's army had been mustered at Newcastle upon Tyne and was prepared to march into Scotland. The Scottish expedition, however, turned out to be a damp squib. The English were forced to resort to burning and pillaging whatever they could find in order to advance. This included destroying the abbeys of Dryburgh, Melrose and Newbattle, their supplies desperately running low due to the Scots having already stripped the land bare before the arrival of Richard's army. They were then denied the opportunity for a full-scale battle due to the entirely predictable tactical retreat of the Scots. They did this to further exacerbate Richard's supply issues. In the meantime, Carlisle, which was located over 100 miles away, was taken by the French and the Scots. This, of course, just rubbed salt into the wounds. Richard returned home without anything to show for his exploits north of the border. The possibility of a French invasion of the English south coast intensified in 1386. In his capacity as Chancellor, Michael de la Pole asked for taxation at a previously unheard of amount for the protection of the realm in the Parliament of October that year. But the Parliament had had enough of the Chancellor. They responded by rejecting all requests until de la Pole was dismissed. It is likely that the Duke of Gloucester, the King's uncle, and the Earl of Arundel provided assistance to the Parliament, subsequently known as the Wonderful Parliament. Upon hearing Parliament's demands, the King famously retaliated by saying that he would not fire even one maid from his kitchen on their say-so. However, Richard was then gently reminded by his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, of the fate of his great-grandfather, Edward II. Well, of course, this did the trick. Threatened with deposition and a high probability of death, Richard quickly but reluctantly agreed to Parliament's demands, and de la Pole was imprisoned. A panel was then established to examine, oversee and effectively control the royal finances for a whole year. The King, of course, saw this as an affront, but he knew he was boxed into a corner. These restrictions were intolerable to Richard, who after a short period swiftly freed his Chancellor from prison and left on an apparent journey across the nation, obviously to elude the Lord Commissioners as he deliberated his next course of action. he called the county sheriffs to a meeting and instructed them to gather their armies to battle the lords who were against him. This, of course, would have resulted in civil war, and the demand was flatly refused. Richard then turned his attention to Cheshire. By appointing Robert de Vere to the position of Justice of Chester, he started the process of building a dependable military power base in Cheshire. Additionally, he was successful in getting Chief Justice, the corrupt Robert Tressilian, to rule that the recent actions of Parliament had been both illegal and treasonous. To achieve this, though, through Tressilian, he used the very real threat of death to convince several justices to vote in favour of the king's demands. Armed with these new rulings, Richard proceeded back to the capital in 1387, brimming with confidence. He must have thought that the citizens' enthusiastic greeting upon his return to London would mean that his efforts against the Lords would change for the better. But when he implored Londoners to fight and support him, they declined. It became crystal clear that there were few people who supported Richard's cause. They simply could not bring themselves to fight for, as they saw it, the wealthy and dishonest Michael de la Pole, the corrupt Robert de Vere, together with several other of the king's cronies. It's really not difficult to understand why. Richard's steadfast loyalty to his dishonest favourites was a clear indication that he was guided by his own desires rather than what was good for his people and country. In an effort to meet up with and provide military support to the king, Robert de Vere assembled an army of 5,000 men near the borders of Wales and Cheshire. This was led by the very able Sir Thomas Molyneux, the Constable of Chester. They then marched towards London. However, on December the 20th, he was cut off in Oxfordshire by the Lords and their much stronger forces. They arrived here at Radcot Bridge, only to find a much larger army confronting them, led by Henry Bolingbroke. Now, today this place is so tranquil and idyllic, but back then there were literally thousands of men facing each other across these lands. Even though Bolingbroke had superior numbers, Molyneux was undaunted and determined to attack. Unlike his own army, they crucially held back, knowing full well what their fate would be if they proceeded into battle. Molyneux, though, pressed on with a small number of willing men and made it to the bridge, but quickly realised the situation was futile and leapt into the Thames in an attempt to save himself. Bolingbroke's right-hand man, Sir Roger Mortimer, stood on the bank mocking Molyneux. Molyneux then pleaded for his life, but Mortimer let him know in no uncertain terms what the outcome would be. So Molyneux decided to die fighting, and as he was clambering up the riverbank, Mortimer yanked off his helmet and plunged his dagger into his head, killing him instantly. Robert de Vere, though, saw the writing on the wall. During the confusion, he managed to slip away from the events and made it to the riverbank further downstream. He swam across to the other side, managed to evade his pursuers and finally made it to the south coast. From there he crossed the channel and lived out his days in exile in France. The majority of de Vere's army were then disarmed before they then trudged home to Cheshire. One of the key turning points in Richard's rule was this embarrassing fiasco. Richard would never forget the events of Radcot Bridge. Now that de Vere and de la Pole were in exile, Richard was alone with no power base. Richard was compelled to accept the charge of treason brought against his supporters, and on February the 3rd, 1388, he convened what came to be known as the Merciless Parliament. Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole were both absent when they were given the death penalty. Nicholas Brembre was convicted and executed, while Robert Tressilian was seized during the trial and accused of providing aid and counsel to the traitors, and was also summarily executed. Despite protests from the clergy, the Lords and Commons went further, impeaching more of Richard's friends and advisers. Sir Simon Burley, who had fought alongside the Black Prince in Spain in 1367 and had also served as Richard's childhood tutor, was swiftly executed. He was particularly close to Richard. At his coronation, he was seen carrying the young king on his shoulders. In 1382, he had arranged Richard's marriage to his beloved Anne. Burghley's death was a tremendous personal loss to Richard. The men that had subjected Richard to this humiliation and defeat were known as the Lords Appellant, of which there were 5, and they were the King's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, Thomas de Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, and finally Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. Now he appears to have become involved only when he seemed certain who would win the day. The Lords Appellant were then locked in a meeting at the Tower with Richard for several days while they attempted to come up with a solution for the way forward. One of the options was the King's deposition. However, the threat of civil war seems to have convinced them to discount this for now. The Appellants then did something quite unexpected. They all swore allegiance to the King in front of witnesses, but they also formed a council around Richard. This ensured that the King did things their way. In so doing, they obviously enriched themselves from all this. Richard would now be sure to remember what these men had done to him. For the King, this was a hard-learned lesson, and he would have to wait a number of years to exact his revenge. In May 1389, when Richard was just 22 years old, he made clear his intention to assume full control of the country. Nobody stood in his way, not even the 5 Lords Appellant. They seemed content that he was now of age and had probably learnt the hard lessons of kingship. Things started well for the King. Early in the 1390s, there was a period of peace and prosperity throughout the realm. A truce with France had been negotiated and renewed, which reduced the need to raise money in taxation. Importantly though, Richard engineered a far better working relationship and peaceful coexistence with his adversaries, the 5 Appellants. But, sadly for the realm, this period of peace and understanding was shattered by tragedy for Richard. In 1394, Richard's beloved Queen, Anne, died from plague. This totally devastated Richard. Some chroniclers have stated that Anne had played a crucial role by the side of the King, and she had been a strong, steadying influence on him, maybe even curbing some of his renowned volatility. For the King though, whilst the marriage had been a success, inasmuch as they were clearly a devoted couple, their union bore no children, so Richard remained without an heir. Upon her death, the King ordered the destruction of the manor house at Sheen. This is where the Queen died and where they both had spent much time together in her final years. One example of Richard's potential volatility was recorded at Queen Anne's funeral. Richard was furious as he believed the Earl of Arundel had caused a delay to the burial procession at Westminster Abbey, and in a fit of rage he snatched a pallbearer's cane and hit Arundel over the head, badly cutting it in the process. Arundel fell heavily to the ground and had to be helped to his feet. The period of peaceful coexistence was apparently over. As part of the peace agreements with France, discussions began about marrying Isabella, the 6-year-old daughter of the French King Charles VI, to Richard, who was 22 years her senior. There were some misgivings as she was still a young child, but King Richard said that every day would solve that issue and that it was actually a benefit because he could then mould her into his ideal queen, while still being young enough to wait for an heir. King Richard proceeded to Paris to meet up with his future bride. When there, he took part in the many celebrations that were held. Then, the French court and the English guests made their way to Calais, where on October the 31st, 1396, the wedding ceremony was held. It was agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until at least the bride's 12th birthday. Richard's strategy of making peace with England's long-time foe received a mixed reaction at best from the English public. Chroniclers writing after his downfall consistently suggested that he was sympathetic to the French king to the point of betraying his own people. But in 1396, the marriage might be interpreted as a symbol of Richard's straightforward belief that he had time on his side. Richard was at the height of his power at this point, mostly thanks to the 28-year truce with his old enemy France and the money it subsequently brought him. It helped, of course, that Isabella came with £130,000 dowry. The final 3 years of Richard's reign were tumultuous to say the least. These years are now known as the Tyranny of Richard II. The event started during the January Parliament of 1397. Now England had been at peace for a number of years, and usually the peace dividend would bring prosperity to the nation as a whole. Understandably, wars are expensive, but Richard's court demanded more and more money to serve its excesses, so it was hardly surprising that many nobles wanted big cuts to the king's largesse and expenditure. During that parliament, the Commons put to Richard a request that the expensive excesses of the king's household should be reduced. Richard, of course, was furious and immediately refused this request and again put himself at odds with Parliament. Later on that year, in the summer, Richard surprised everyone as he moved against his old enemies. Now the reasons as to why he did this remain uncertain to this very day. Many have said that it was as a result of the king's long simmering need for revenge for the humiliation he suffered at the hands of the Appellants a decade earlier, and that this had finally boiled over. The king invited the Earls of Warwick and Arundel together with the Duke of Gloucester to dine with him, but Arundel and Gloucester declined the invitation, Gloucester feigning illness, while Arundel flatly refused. They both had been forewarned about Richard's true intentions. Warwick, though, attended and was promptly arrested. Arundel was tricked by Richard and also soon found himself behind bars. Finally, Richard managed to track down and arrest his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and promptly imprisoned him in Calais. They were all now behind bars, awaiting the next Parliament that was due to take place in the September of 1397. The September Parliament of 1397 became known as the Revenge Parliament. Well, it couldn't really be known as anything else after it became obvious what Richard was up to. The king had packed the Parliament to the rafters with his own followers. Removing the 3 former appellants would also have the added advantage of eliminating a potential threat to his reign. To ensure his own security during this Parliament, Richard had positioned his own personal army of 2,000 Cheshire archers all around the Parliament building. The charges against Gloucester and Arundel were for treason. Arundel defended himself vigorously. He shouted his insistence that he was no traitor and turned on those who gave evidence against him, claiming that they were lying. He directed most of his anger, though, to Henry Bolingbroke, who had turned the tables and testified against his former fellow Lords Appellant. Arundel's protestations were to no avail. He was swiftly beheaded, and guess where he was executed? Well, exactly the same spot as that of Richard's great friend, Simon de Burley. Richard then called for his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, to be transported from Calais to stand trial at the Parliament. However, the reply to this request was received and read out, saying that the Duke could not be sent to Parliament due to the fact that he was now dead. It is known that Gloucester had been tortured to death up to 2 weeks before the news of his demise was announced. In fact, in early September, Richard had sent a delegation to Calais with the aim of getting a signed confession from the Duke, which of course they duly did. Gloucester's confession also included a plea for mercy. The Duke was posthumously labelled a traitor and all of his possessions seized. Warwick was subsequently brought to the Parliament for trial and quickly provided a full confession, and he too pleaded for his life. Richard gave him his life, but he was to spend the rest of it behind bars. At the end of September 1397, Richard rewarded his followers for their loyalty. Notable among these was one of the former Lords Appellant, Henry Bolingbroke, who was elevated to be the Duke of Hereford. The December of 1397 saw a final twist to the story of the two remaining former Lords Appellant. Mowbray and Henry Bolingbroke fell out accusing each other of treason. Bolingbroke claimed that Mowbray had told him, "We are about to be destroyed because of what happened at Radcot Bridge." Henry again swore allegiance to the king, claiming that he totally believed the king's sincerity when Richard pardoned them for their past demeanours. The two of them intended to settle the score with a fight to the death. The king intervened and put a stop to the confrontation. After much toing and froing though, Richard in the end decided to settle the issue once and for all. He sent both the Duke of Hereford, Henry Bolingbroke, and Thomas de Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, into exile. 10 years for Bolingbroke and life for Mowbray. With the king's adversaries now out of the way, Richard was able to develop a far more authoritarian rule of the nation. This in itself was very unusual for medieval England. During this time, a very different court culture was encouraged to grow. This painting here in Westminster Abbey is a great depiction of Richard. It was painted around 1394 and is supposed to be a fairly accurate rendition of the king. Its eyes seem to follow you wherever you go. Richard adopted a propensity for insisting that anyone who came into contact with the king's gaze were immediately required to drop to one knee and kneel before him. During festivals, he would often remain motionless, sitting high up on his chair in the royal hall overlooking everyone. He would sometimes keep this up for hours. This picture provides the viewer with a good idea of how he must have looked overlooking proceedings from up high. One of the reasons he pursued a peace policy with France was so as to avoid being reliant on the nobility for military support. However, he enlarged his own private military force of Cheshire men. This included groups of loyal knights and men-at-arms, all wearing the king's livery badge of the White Hart. Their sworn duty was to support the king in times of danger, to be his own personal guard. He favoured Cheshire over all other regions and he made no attempt to disguise it. The White Hart, of course, was the noblest beast in the hunt, and the symbol was used extensively by Richard's court. All of this enabled him to create a courtly setting where the king was of course at the head, a revered, distant figure where art and culture, rather than military conflict, were valued. Now this is London's Trafalgar Square, and overlooking it is the National Gallery. The reason I'm here is to see this, the Wilton diptych. It is a painting on two oak panels connected together by hinges. This was commissioned by Richard, and some believe it to be a private shrine, so he could meditate in front of and reflect on his duties as king. As we can see, we have a young Richard kneeling in front of two Anglo-Saxon saints, Edmund and Edward the Confessor, together with John the Baptist. The king is thought to have insisted on a younger depiction of himself, probably around 14 years old, as this was the time of his greatest achievements in suppressing the Peasants Revolt. Interestingly, behind the Christ child we see a number of angels all wearing Richard's emblem, the White Hart. Richard's obvious favouritism to the county of Cheshire brought much dismay across the rest of the country and alienated the remainder of his people. Richard made Chester a principality, effectively its own kingdom within a kingdom. He used money from other regions to enrich this new principality, regarding the region as his own personal stronghold. If he wanted the rest of his people to feel estranged from the king and the establishment in general, he couldn't have found a better way of going about it. In 1397 onwards, his private army of Cheshire archers and axemen constantly followed him around the country. They were renowned for their brutality towards the rest of the general populace. One chronicler of the time wrote, "Since for every man he chose to favour, he missed 200 others who might have loved him." To his subjects, Richard gave the impression that he was a man who, despite his efforts to make peace and reconciliation with his enemies abroad, he seemed to be someone who was always looking over his shoulder, expecting to fight his very own people at home. With no checks or balances in place to rein in Richard's authoritarian and absolute rule, he could pretty much do what he wanted. This can be seen by the king's treatment of many other nobles in England. He often confiscated their lands and or extorted money from practically anyone. He did this as and when he pleased. This rule of fear was stoking some deep-seated resentment within the country's aristocracy, from the Scottish borders down to the tip of Cornwall. Many of the great and the good were wondering who would be next to donate to the king's coffers. The end to Richard's rule was remarkably swift, and the chain of events started on February the 3rd, 1399, with the death of John of Gaunt. Now remember, his son Henry Bolingbroke was living in Paris in exile, serving a period of 10 years. This is where Richard massively miscalculated. Upon Gaunt's death, Richard made the decision to immediately extend his cousin Bolingbroke's exile to life, and also decided to confiscate his properties, robbing him of his inheritance. The king felt secure from any trouble Bolingbroke could make for him from across the channel. This mistake would come to prove fatal. The king then made another disastrous decision, and that was to launch a campaign in Ireland in the May of 1399, taking him and his army out of the country. Meanwhile, in France, the insane Charles VI court was taken over by Louis I, Duke of Orleans, in June 1399. Louis thought it opportune to permit Henry Bolingbroke to depart for England, since the policy of rapprochement with the English monarch did not suit his own political aspirations. This couldn't have worked out better for Bolingbroke. He swiftly gathered a small band of followers and set sail for England. He arrived in Ravenspurn, Yorkshire, at the end of June. One of Bolingbroke's first actions was to meet up with his powerful ally Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland. Bolingbroke assured him that his only goal was to reclaim his inheritance. Percy, however, had his own reservations about the king and took him at his word, choosing not to become involved. Bolingbroke encountered little opposition on his march through England, since the majority of the king's household knights and the devoted aristocracy had been taken to Ireland. In fact, much of the nobility remaining in England both despised and feared Richard to the extent that they wouldn't shed any tears if he was no longer their king. As a result of all this, Henry Bolingbroke's ranks swelled as he headed away from Ravenspurn. Richard was incensed when told of Bolingbroke's landing in England, and immediately made plans to rush back and confront his cousin. Richard's journey from Ireland, though, was delayed, and it wasn't until the 24th of July that he arrived in Wales. By then, though, it quickly dawned on him that the battle was already lost. Richard was then taken to Flint Castle on August the 19th to meet up with Henry Bolingbroke, where he offered to abdicate if his life was spared. The angry king then travelled back to London, all the way firmly in Henry's shadow as they headed towards the capital. Richard was then swiftly locked up in the Tower of London on September the 1st, 1399. Now, one particular chronicle relayed details of a meeting between Henry and Richard that happened the day before Parliament met. The king lost complete control of his emotions and physically threatened Henry, ordered his own release from the Tower, demanded to see his wife and labelled his cousin a traitor and vowed retaliation. The king could shout and scream as much as he liked. This all meant nothing to Henry. Apparently, Bolingbroke just remained in silence and walked out of the room, head held high, knowing full well that Richard knew who held all the cards. While Henry Bolingbroke's initial intention was to reclaim his inheritance, or so he claimed, the swiftness of his success and the goodwill shown to him by the masses and the establishment at large led him to acquire a far loftier prize, the crown itself. When Parliament gathered to decide what should happen to Richard, 33 deposition articles were read out and were formally accepted. King Richard II was then formally deposed on October the 1st, 1399. His successor would be a foregone conclusion, Henry Bolingbroke, and he was duly crowned king on October the 13th. Henry Bolingbroke, now known as Henry IV, was besieged by well-wishers when he took the throne, pleading with him to put Richard to death. After all, Richard wasn't completely friendless, and it was common knowledge that a few disgruntled nobles and other troublemakers could easily spark uprisings and rebellion in favour of a former king, and sure enough, it didn't take long for this to happen. 3 months after Henry was crowned king, the first insurrection nearly resulted in the death of the new monarch. Richard was discreetly transported to and isolated at a Lancaster stronghold in the north, Pontefract Castle, but his supporters, who Henry had magnanimously pardoned previously, had plotted to assassinate the new king and his family during a lavish tournament scheduled for January the 6th at Windsor Castle. Their ambitions, though, were only thwarted by a last-minute betrayal. Sadly for Richard, this rebellion went a long way to deciding the ex-king's fate. But did it? The unfortunate former king's destiny was still a mystery to everyone. The kingdom was rife with rumours. On February the 17th, all of a sudden, it was reported that the former king had died and was being transported back to London. Just to be clear, Richard passed away on February the 14th. However, this looks to be a convenient date without any proof. Why? Well, nobody even knows how he died. If anyone did, their lips were tightly sealed. There were numerous different accounts for how Richard died, but by far the most plausible is that he was starved of food and water and died a miserable, painful death as his body slowly shut down. King Henry prepared an elaborate parade to transport Richard's body from Pontefract to London while exposing it for the public to see. This was in order to persuade the populace that the former king had indeed died. The body was encased in lead, save for his face from the eyebrows to the throat. The king attended a very solemn funeral that took place in St Paul's Cathedral and was held over 2 days. The former king's body was then delivered to the Blackfriars at the royal property of Chiltern Langley. They then buried Richard in secret there. At Westminster Abbey, the construction of Richard's tomb was now complete and was ready for the royal body. Henry the usurper, though, didn't want to attract any unwanted attention for the deposed king, so he kept him where he was for the remainder of his reign. When Henry IV died in 1413, his son and successor, Henry V, moved Richard at great expense from Langley to his actual tomb in Westminster Abbey, symbolically burying him and thus establishing Henry V as the legitimate king. So Richard finally joined with his wife Anne, who had already previously been buried in the tomb. By rejecting the militaristic monarchical tradition exemplified by his grandfather Edward III, Richard presented a fundamental new image of kingship in England. The notion was that a man's honour and privilege came directly from the king, whom the subjects were expected to totally obey, if not fear, and this came to define Richard's rule. Shakespeare's play Richard II has had the biggest impact on how people generally perceive Richard. Shakespeare's Richard was a ruthless, vengeful and careless ruler who only appeared to attain greatness after he was driven from power. Shakespeare of course made significant omissions and took many liberties when writing his account. Richard's reign can be said to be by and large a peaceful one, with a distinct lack of military campaigning that had normally been undertaken by the previous Plantagenet monarchs. Of course, the absence of war would usually lead to a reduction in the taxation burden for the masses. This in turn should have resulted in Richard enjoying much popularity, leading him to being able to take pleasure in a successful reign. But no. These benefits were never realised due to the costs incurred by Richard's extravagant patronage for his favourites and the general opulence of his court. So any expected peace dividend was never seen by his people, only he and his court largely benefited. This, together with Richard's exclusive reliance and favouritism shown to the county of Cheshire at the expense of all others, harmed his support from the rest of the country and greatly contributed to his eventual downfall. Well, on that note, I would like to thank you for watching this video, and please hit the like button if you have found it enlightening. Please do consider subscribing if you would like to see more content such as this. If you fancy a trip through the lives of other famous people and events, please do click on one of the other productions shown above. Once again, thanks for watching, and I really hope to see you next time. Bye for now.